I'd like to welcome to Cambridge Forum this evening, Cassandra Pybus.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm adjusting to the climate. Of course, I come from hot summer, and so somebody asked me whether I brought any warm clothes with me, and I said I brought all my warm clothes with me, and then I had to go and buy more to put on top of it. But thank God for Filene's basement. It was a great find. Anyway, I might start by telling you why it is that an Australian historian, as I'm primarily a historian of colonial Australia, should be writing a book about, at least that has its roots in the American Revolution. It was certainly never my intention to do so. No novice is going to go plunging into such an enormous area of historiography as the American Revolution forewarned. But I didn't expect it, because what happened was that I came to find out, whilst looking to see whether there were ever any black people who came to Australia in the colonial period whose descendants might mistake themselves to be Aboriginal, that on the very first fleet in 1788 there were 12 African Americans, and that one of these in particular took my fancy because he became Australia's first bushranger. Now, you may not know what this means, but any Australian instantly knows how important that is. In fact, when I say that, they gasp. And the reason they gasp is that for Australians, our kind of major cultural figure is cultural and political, sociological, historical figure is not someone like George Washington, some thoroughly respectable political and military figure. Indeed, it's a completely unrespectable figure. It's the runaway convict who took to the bush with his musket and lived by robbery under arms, basically. The bush ranger, the most famous of whom is Ned Kelly, who some of you may know from Peter Carey's outstanding book, The True Story of the Kelly Gang. Ned Kelly is the son of a runaway convict, but he's the sort of apotheosis of that tradition. And what I was astonished to discover was that the very first, the prototype bushranger, the prototype cultural icon for Australia, was in fact this black man called Caesar, Black Caesar, he was known as. And so I wanted to write a book about him. I wanted to find out who he was, where he came from, and the other 11 who were on the first fleet with him. And so I went back to their trial records, and their trial records told me a little bit in some places, nothing in other cases. But where they did tell me something, it all pointed back to the American colonies. And it was apparent to me that these people had come to England at the end of the American Revolution, and that they would probably come as part of the Loyalist evacuation. And so, with sinking heart, I realised that I was now going to have to tackle the historiography of the American Revolution, which I did fairly superficially. I sort of plunged in and discovered that there was this group of people who were identified first by well, indeed, probably much earlier than Benjamin Quails, but Benjamin Quails really focused in on the people known as the Black Loyalists, that is, runaways who forged alliances with the British during the American Revolution. So I read his book, and I read Sylvia Fry's book, and I read other people's books, and I thought, right, I've got that, got the historiography right. Now I can go on and find the stories of individuals who I'm interested in. But as I kept kind of hunting around in the archives, digging deeper and deeper, looking for the needles in the haystack, it began to dawn on me that the narrative that I'd been reading in all of these books on the black response to the American Revolution didn't stack up against what I was reading in the British, and particularly in the British archives, and that there was a whole other story to be told. And so I promise you that it was never my intention to plunge into becoming a revisionist historian of the American Revolution, but it does seem that I'm always going to be tarred with that particular brush, I fear, because it is true that I have, that my book is in many ways challenging the received story about the African American runaways who ran to the British. First of all, it was clear to me that there were not huge numbers of them. There were not 100,000. There were not 50,000. There was probably 20,000, mostly in South Carolina and Virginia, over a period of between 1775 and 1782. Of those people, a huge number. In Virginia, maybe as much as 40%. In South Carolina, 25 to 30% died of smallpox and epidemic disease. It is an astonishing thing to think about. And even with Elizabeth Fenn's brilliant book on smallpox during the American Revolution, I don't think anybody has actually kind of put their imagination to work at the scale of that particular disaster. And it is very focused. It doesn't spread out over the war. It's very focused on a couple of key incidents. One of them is in Virginia in 1776. Some of you may know that the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, offered slaves who ran to the British freedom if they took up arms for the king. And in response to that, there were, despite the difficulties of actually reaching Lord Dunmore, because he was on a fleet of ships in the James River, there was a considerable response of several thousand runaways who managed to get onto these ships. But at the same time, as this revolutionary upheaval hits both Massachusetts and Virginia, so does smallpox. And these crowded ships were just the perfect incubators. And of course, native-born people in America had no resistance to smallpox. The British had both resistance and the military were inoculated against it. So you have this extraordinary kind of situation in which there are these pestilential ships just full of dying people with smallpox, which is, after all, one of the most hideous diseases. And the British surgeons are trying to inoculate people at the same time as every day brings fresh numbers of runaway slaves. And so even when they find a little island that they can isolate people on to inoculate them, everybody's so weakened that there is then a wave of typhoid fever sweeps through. And so the death toll is at least 70%, maybe more. I mean, the number of dead bodies that are simply being thrown overboard, buried in shallow graves, is horrifying and shocking. And so inevitably, with that kind of crisis on their hands, there's no way that the British can stay in the Chesapeake. And so they leave to go to what has become the British stronghold now in New York. And just as they are leaving the Chesapeake, the ship that is in the kind of, I'm sure there's a naval term for it that's escaping me, but the first ship of the fleet, HMS Roebuck, goes up the Potomac River to collect some fresh water. And I got this out of the log I read the logs of all the ships to see if they talked about it, really, and some of them do. The captain of the Roebuck talks about it a lot. His log is full of this stuff. But anyway, also in his log is this tiny little thing about when he goes up the Potomac River, he encounters a small craft that's come down the river from Fairfax County, and on board this craft there are, quote, 3 servants of General Washington's. And at first I wasn't sure what this meant, but the British don't always refer to, in fact, often do not refer to enslaved people as slaves. They can call them servants, they can call them slaves, they can call them any number of things. Refugees often in relation to the people that they're picking up during this time. But later, when I was reading the book of the names of people being evacuated from New York, I encountered Harry Washington, who had run away from General Washington in 1776. So obviously, one of the 3 servants of General Washington who is on this ship is his ostler, Harry, who goes on to become a kind of major figure in my story. I was really very interested to see that not only did Harry Washington run away from George Washington, but another 17 or so, 16 people ran away in 1781, which is the next hideous kind of exercise as far as the outbreak of smallpox is concerned, because that again hits at the time that Lord Cornwallis is marching through Virginia on his way to Yorktown with this enormous train. I mean, you don't have to accept the numbers that people like Sylvia Fry talk about to have a sense of the enormity of it. You know, he has 3,000 or 4,000 black runaways in the train of his army. And they're kind of on this forced march. And the only way he can do it, get through Virginia that fast, is to use his black recruits as foragers. And one of the people who is on the march with him, one of the German soldiers, refers to every place they pass through looking like it's been visited by a plague of locusts. And in his wake behind him is General Lafayette with the Continental Army, who is just bemoaning the fact that he doesn't have any Negroes to forage for him or to bring him horses. And that's why Cornwallis manages to stay so far ahead of him. But of course, when they get to Yorktown and get pinned down in Yorktown, they can't get out, it's inevitable that once again smallpox explodes inside that fort. And again, this is one of the terrible stories of the revolution that you never hear about. Not only are they being bombarded day and night so that hardly a building is left standing in Yorktown, but people are just dropping dead everywhere. It's appalling situation. The people who survive out of this, the British look after them. They look after them, they smuggle them out of Yorktown. A huge number of African Americans appear to have been smuggled out of Yorktown on the ships that took the paroled officers after Yorktown to New York. In New York, they stand up to George Washington, who insists that all Negroes with the British have to be left behind, have to be returned to their masters. The new British Commander-in-Chief says he won't do it. Basically, to Washington's astonishment, he says that he cannot conceive that the British king would ever have agreed to such a dishonourable thing to go back on their promises to people of any complexion. And as far as he's concerned, when he arrived in New York, all of those African Americans behind the British lines, there's probably about 5,000 of them, were free. And as far as he was concerned, they are free to go anywhere in the world they wish. And so they have actually evacuated with the English. The reason we know about them is because he agreed to Washington that he would write down their names and the names of the people who claimed to own them. So there I see Harry Washington owned General Washington, claims he ran away from. And there I see several other of Washington's slaves and several of Benjamin Harrison's slaves and several of Patrick Henry's slaves, and I can list the names of the signers of the Declaration of Independence in the South, and all of them have runaway slaves on this list of people who took to their heels with the rhetoric of their masters ringing around their ears and said, well, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Now, this group of people, and my research suggests it's probably about 9,000 to 10,000 people were evacuated with the British during the period of 1782 to 1783. They constitute a sort of diaspora within the diaspora. They fan out through the British Empire, really. They go to places in the Caribbean. They go to St. Lucia. They go to Jamaica. They go to Barbados. Bahamas. They go to that strange unregulated area known as the Mosquito Shore. They go to, in large numbers, they go to Nova Scotia, as you probably know. This is the beginning of the black community in Canada. And they go to England. In fact, the majority of them, one way or the other, fetch up in London. And it's in London that I begin, basically I was faced with the idea of how the difficulty of finding just the few people who'd come to Australia was so enormous that the thought of being able to follow them to St. Lucia and Jamaica and the Bahamas and everywhere else was just, I couldn't do it. I'd still be at it when I was had one foot in the grave. So what I decided to do was that I'd concentrate on the people who go to England, to London, and these two bizarre colonial experiments that start in 1787. One, basically, that take some of these Black Loyalists to separate ends of howling wilderness at separate ends of the globe. One is this providence of freedom in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa, and the other one is Botany Bay on the east coast of what is now called Australia. I really liked the idea of following these people because of the symmetry of it. Basically, they leave almost at the same time. The fleets of ships that take them are moored alongside one another at Spithead. They're being provisioned by the same company at the same time. You know, even to the extent that the British newspapers mix them up, and they say these black settlers who are being taken to Sierra Leone are actually being sent to Australia as prisoners and vice versa, and there's a lot of confusion about it. And so it seemed to me the idea of these two fleets that kind of separate in the Solent and go, you know, one all the way to Australia 10 months later, and the other much shorter but much more disastrous trip to West Africa. So my book sort of bifurcates into the stories of the handful of people who come to Australia and a much larger group that goes to Sierra Leone. The first group of settlers is almost completely decimated by yellow fever. The second group of settlers comes from Nova Scotia. There's a second, much larger group of people, 1,200 people, first settled in Nova Scotia, then resettle in Sierra Leone. And these include the people whom I had picked up in Virginia, in particular Harry Washington. And whilst they're in Sierra Leone, I should track back a little bit and tell you that Sierra Leone was set up by British abolitionists as a quasi-colony, which would be a trading settlement to be a kind of challenge to slavery on the west coast of Africa, settled by free Africans, and it would also be a beachhead for evangelical Christianity into Africa. It was a complete disaster the first time, very poorly thought out. The idea that somehow these self-emancipated people from America, most of whom were not born in Africa, could somehow adjust to the appalling conditions that they encountered when they arrived in the middle of monsoon rains on the west coast of Africa, and as I say, you know, decimated by yellow fever. The second group also seriously ill on their first contact with West Africa, but they kind of dig in there, and for the next, 12 years, there is this constant tussle, and it gets more and more like a struggle with the people who run it, the Sierra Leone Company. The Sierra Leone Company is made up of the most famous names in British abolitionism: William Wilberforce, Henry Thornton, Thomas Clarkson. They do not appreciate that these self-emancipated people who've gone to Sierra Leone want to be free in more than name only. They have clearly, to me it seems, they have taken on board the kind of rhetoric that they've heard all the way through the American Revolution. They understand about liberty and they understand about rights. They have a notion of rights that are so radical by compared for these white Englishmen. I mean, the British labouring classes would never dream of asking for these kinds of rights, you know. They want representation in the government, they want representation in the courts, they want a self-determining, self-governing community, and they want, and basically the Sierra Leone Company point blank refuses to give it to them. And so this tussle gets stronger and more agitated until in 1800 there is something that looks like, and certainly the Sierra Leone Company calls, a rebellion against the Sierra Leone Company. And what's so really, and Harry Washington is one of the leaders of it. And what is so interesting about it, and I'll finish with this, is that it hangs on two particular issues. One is that they are being charged a quit rent, a huge quit rent for the land that they've been given, taxation, unfair taxation, and the other is that they have no representation in the government. It is in fact a fundamental rebellion on the basis of, you know, taxation and representation. It is put down brutally and efficiently by the Sierra Leone company, who just happened to have invited 500 Maroon warriors from Jamaica to come to Sierra Leone, and they arrive at exactly that time and are invited to go and, quote, stretch their legs a little, round up these so-called rebels. They're exported, they're sent. Interestingly enough, they are sent away to slave forts, British slave forts up and down the west coast of Africa. You know, this is a sure sentence of death, and 2 of them are hung. It's an incredibly repressive, draconian response from who? William Wilberforce, Henry Thornton. And it seems to me that the reason that we don't know this story, and that the struggles of people like Harry Washington, the name alone should have been enough to set the alarm bells off. The reason that we don't know about it is because we want to look upon these white abolitionists as the saints of Clapham. We want to see them as the men who struggle. I mean, look at all the books that are coming out about them right now, these laudatory books about them. I mean, and in many ways, they're hugely admirable men. But when it came to self-emancipated slaves who stood on their own legs, weren't kneeling and begging, am I not a man and a brother, but standing up and demanding the rights equivalent to well-educated white Englishmen, then they didn't want to bar off them. And I'll finish with a quote from William Wilberforce about the people whom he sent off to die in slave forts on the west coast of Africa. They are the worst kind of, these self-emancipated slaves are the worst kind of settlers, he said, as thorough Jacobins as if they'd been trained and educated in Paris. But of course, they were trained and educated in the American Revolution, and let us not forget it. Thank you.
Well, this is marvelous. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Cassandra Pybus discussing epic journeys of freedom. The symmetry is amazing to have Washington, the other Washington. Yes. Maybe the more widely traveled Washington being put down by the British. But I want to backtrack a little bit. Maybe that's a bad choice of words here, because I'm thinking about tracking unlettered men and women, and especially slaves. And this is a problem that challenges everybody who tries to study slaves, to try to uncover their experiences. And that's trying to find them. They don't leave paper trails. They don't leave us bodies of correspondence and diaries and letters and memoirs, all these things that are really the historians' tools of the trade. This is the material that most historians work with. But those of us who look at slavery are denied those. And just speaking from my own experience, looking at slaves in a very small place, they don't wander the globe. I have spent probably way too long tracking their lives over the course of 40 years in a very tiny location.
Good for you.
I know an awful lot about them. And so when I read Cassandra's book, I was just absolutely astonished. I mean, thinking about how difficult my task has been, I can't even imagine how monumental your task has been. So, I mean, where do you even know where to start? I mean, you mentioned the Book of Negroes, but
yeah, that's where
how do we piece these stories together?
I think I'm lucky, and other historians of slavery have pointed this out to me, that Australian historians have got an amazing resource in that Australia was settled as a penal colony, and so for nearly 50 years we had these very well documented mostly illiterate people coming. And so it's a system of surveillance and control, and one of the ways that you keep control and keep surveillance is by keeping detailed accounts of what people look like, what kind of scars they have on their body, everything that happens to them from the moment that they arrive in Australia. So one of the first things that I had to work with was that I had good convict records. Not so much in the very early period, but there's a little bit. But it gets much better later on when you're looking for other African Americans. So I started working with that material, and then I realised that there was also good material in England in relation to the trial records. As soon as see, one of the problems with slaves is they don't get into the British legal system because they've got their own slave courts. But in England, there are no such thing as slave courts, and that people, whether they're enslaved or free, are going to come up in the legal system. Most of them live in London, and so therefore they're either going to be in the Middlesex Assizes or in the Old Bailey. Now, if you're lucky enough for them to have been tried at the Old Bailey, an account of their trial will be in the Old Bailey session papers, and sometimes those accounts are very, very detailed. You know, he said, they give you all the witnesses, and so you realise that there were, you know, all these, and you can get them online now too, and you can search them by keyword. I couldn't do that when I started this, but I found a lot more interesting stuff since I've been able to do that. So that once I began to see that there was, you know, that there was material there that would point me in certain directions, and the issue about whether or not they were Christian, whether or not they'd been baptised would come up. And so then I started looking at the baptismal records, and I was very lucky in that the British Metropolitan Archives in London had undertaken a project to pull out the names of people that they thought over, you know, 500-year period from, you know, 500 parishes who they thought might be of African descent. And so I could, you know, there was a hell of a lot of them, but I could go through them. And so I began, but the real breakthrough was when I found in the papers of Sir Guy Carleton these handwritten names, accounts, what was called the Book of Negroes, all handwritten, you know. Oh, I thought I was in heaven because I could find some people I'd already found. I could find some of the people who came to Australia there. I could find other people there, but what really surprised me was that they were said in the Book of Negroes that they were going to Nova Scotia, but I had them being tried in London. And so, first of all, I thought maybe it were people of the same name. But then I had a good friend who went to live in Nova Scotia, and she did some fabulous research for me. She just went through every single thing you could possibly read in Nova Scotia to see whether these people ever turned up there. Musters, everything that related to, and the British are very good at keeping records in the colonies. And it was clear to me that they'd never gone to Nova Scotia, or either that or they'd taken one look at Halifax and go, woo, this is way too cold for me, and then got on a ship that had taken them to London. So the Book of Negroes was, and if you don't know about it, you can actually get it online now. You can actually download it and then search it by keyword, search it, cross-reference it, break it down by, you know, counties, which is one of the things that I did. And then, once I started breaking it down by counties, I started to see extraordinary patterns in the way in which people who form families, extended families, had all run at the same time. And that they had run from plantations, different plantations, but they had basically run at the same time. And I began to see that this was one of the most extraordinary things, that there'd never been anything like it before. That what was happening was that whole extended families were running to the British. And that in itself was just mind-boggling. And so, I mean, I still think there's a lot more work to be done on that. So if anybody's got any graduate students who are looking for a superb project, I can tell you there's some fantastic demographic work to be done on the Book of Negroes. But, so there's that. So little by little, I had to kind of, my Caesar, do you imagine how difficult it is to find somebody called Caesar in the Revolutionary Records? There's something like 10 of them at the Book of Negroes alone. I mean, they're everywhere, Caesars. So, I mean, I found a number of Caesars about the right age for my Caesar, but one of them belonged to George Washington. But who's to say? So I had to basically drop my story of running with Caesar because I couldn't find them. There are other people I could find, but then suddenly their trail would go cold. So that when you read my book, you'll see that there are very few people who I can track from go to woe. You know, it's kind of clear trajectory of their story. There's one guy called John Mosley who goes to Australia. I'm very proud of having found him. There is always the possibility that the Jack Mosley who ran away from Edward Hack Mosley in 1775 may not be the John Mosley who dies in Sydney in 1836, but I deeply believe that it is. All the circumstantial evidence suggests to me it is. And if I've made a mistake about that, I think that if it wasn't that runaway slave who died in Sydney in 1783, it's another runaway slave. So what I tried to do was get stories that I could track a certain way and other stories I'd pick up. And so in the back of the book, I've got this list of biographies, so you can keep flipping to the back if you've kind of lost the trail with somebody. But basically, I've sort of focused on about 20 or 30 people, and the book is framed by the story of Harry Washington because it would have to be, wouldn't it? But I know very little about him, actually. I mean, finally, I could find him in Washington's papers on bills of sale. I know when Washington bought him. I know how he used him, and I know what happens to him in the end, and I found him on musters in Nova Scotia. But really, how he lived his life in Sierra Leone, I simply do not know. And that's true largely for a lot of them. So it would have to be said that, you know, I'm going for a kind of cumulative biography in some respects, in that, you know, I've got a lot of people and I can tell you a bit about this one, a bit about this one, and so there's a sense of, you know, an ongoing story. But I believe, unlike Simon Sharma, that it is not the historian's position to make up what they don't know. I mean, if the evidence isn't there, you're just going to have to leave the gaps in the narrative. You've got to deal with those gaps and hesitancies and those terrible words like there's no way of knowing, or possibly, maybe. I've tried not to litter my text with those words, with those qualifiers, but inevitably the gaps have got to be there, because I'm not, tempting though it is, I haven't allowed my imagination to kind of fill in what I don't know. So there we go.
But even then, I mean, there's just it's amazing to be able to depict, to represent individuals instead of categories. And this is, I mean, this is one of the most marvelous things about your book.
Well, I deeply believe that's what historians should be engaged in doing.
Okay, so you're listening to Cassandra Pybus discussing epic journeys of freedom, and as you can probably imagine, I am full of questions, but I think it's time now to open up to take questions from the audience. Please follow this gentleman's example and use the microphone here in the center. Thank you.
Excuse me. As a historian, could you speculate to what would happen if the American political leaders dealt with slavery after the Revolutionary War?
You know, this is the book that people should be writing about. This is the book that people should be writing. These are the books that should be winning the Pulitzer Prize. These are the big fat books that we need to see. What would have happened if the American Revolution had have got rid of slavery? The fact that people won't even risk their arm and try it, really, as an outsider, breaks my heart. I think that you know, it's something that would take an enormous amount of work to think through, and I can't answer your question. But I can throw out the question to say is, why are people not writing these books? Why is there not a best-selling book in the Co-op or in Harvard Books about positing how the American Revolution could have gone another way? It could so easily have gone another way. So, yes.
I commend you for your diligent mining of the archives. I am a student of the African diaspora and of Maroon societies, and I'm aware that the story you tell is late, that we have from 1537 narrative of successful resistance to slavery by running away. And so my question to you is this difficulty of whom are we talking about? Negroes, slaves, fugitives, blacks. Later in your book, I'm halfway through it, you speak, for example, of these refugees as allies of the British. And I read texts like this very carefully to see to what extent historians are appraising themselves of racism and ethnocentrism, because we tend to conflate, you see, people of color, for example, one drop of black as being not white. And from the very beginning of our culture contact here, there have been people who have been exercising agency, who have not pretended to be free. They have exercised their freedom like any worker anywhere by withholding their labor for a period of time or for forever. And I don't know if I really have a question. I would like you to kind of respond to this, because you seem to be assuming that there are not scholars, for example, who deal with this.
Don't assume that.
And I looked at your bibliography, for example, to see if you had used C.L.R. James's work on Black Jacobins, which.
If I had have put in my bibliography all the books that I'd read, my publishers would shoot me. As it was, they were not disinclined to put a bibliography in at all, and it does say it's a select bibliography, and I'm not talking about the Caribbean. The issue about who I'm talking about is I'm talking about a group of people who clearly identified at the time in both American and British archival records, and that they are identified usually as being, depending on which side of the fence you're coming from, they're identified as being slaves or Negroes or black. When I get down to talk about individuals, as you'll see, for example, Harry Washington probably comes from the area known as Senegambia, and Isaac Anderson comes from Angola, and others were American-born, it would seem. But the issue of agency, I'm not addressing the issue of agency any more than within this cohort, because I'm interested in them, because 12 of them ended up in Australia. And so I think that on the particular issue, various people, Marcus Rediker, for example, told me that I shouldn't use the term Black Loyalists because they were people who were kind of using the British for their own purposes and that they weren't really loyalists, and I accepted this and did not use it for a long time. But of course, the fact of the matter is that they're a fiercely loyal group of people, and all the way through their kind of the exercise of their agency, part of this is their constant appeals to the king, to King George, who they admire and like and think is their friend, with very good reason, as it happens, because he actually does pay attention and take interest at various points in their particular case. They are allies of the British because they actually choose, they take sides, they actually choose to fight with the British, and they do. And they both fight and they provide an enormous amount of support services. So that I think the choice of the word ally is the correct choice, that they have actually allied themselves to the British. They're not, that this is a less kind of subservient or that, you know, they're not just in the wake of the army. I mean, they're actually, I mean, even where I talk about the long train of Cornwallis's army, it's very clear to me, and I make it very clear in the book, that they're fundamentally important to the running and organisation of that army, and they're fundamentally important to the running and organisation of Yorktown. And it's when epidemic disease takes hold in Yorktown, the game is up, the story's over. These issues about non-reclampture are terrifying, you know, we could talk about it all night.
Two questions. Where does your book end? At what point in history do you?
1800.
Okay. You made a statement about how we could have solved the slavery issue after the American Revolution. I'm not sure how we could have done that, because in the Continental Congress, the vote had to be unanimous for independence. Mm-hmm. And the South said, unless you take the slavery clause out of the Declaration, we are walking out, and you will not have your vote, and you will not have your independence. So they were really split. They had no choice but to give in on the slavery issue, even though they knew it was wrong and it was going to haunt the country later. So I'm not sure how you can say we could have then, after we had defeated the British, how were we going to solve slavery at that point?
Well, you know, us Americans, of course, are very used to thinking about the United States as including Georgia and South Carolina. And why didn't it include East Florida? Why didn't it include Nova Scotia? Why didn't it include Quebec? Why didn't it include what were all of the British American colonies? For the very good reason that some of them chose not to rebel against the British. And so in the business of sorting out what kind of a nation you're going to be, or what kind of a united society you're going to be, I think the issue could come up about, you know, whether you know, how far if South Carolina and Georgia, for example. I mean, I think that Virginia is a much more complicated issue than those two ex-colonies, that perhaps the shape of the United States would have been different. Perhaps the shape of the Continental Congress would have been different, if indeed that argument was taken a little further than it was. That's what I'm saying. I mean, I think this is something worth speculating about. I think that it's too easy to say we couldn't possibly have done it. And not only is there the issue about why didn't you get rid of slavery, but why was slavery so thoroughly entrenched and made so much worse following the establishment of the United States? These are the kinds of issues that I still think historians need to grapple with. I don't know myself whether it was possible, but I would like to see somebody giving it a little bit more of a go. Well,
yeah, and it was entrenched up in the north too. I mean, a lot of the New England
Absolutely.
Shipbuilders were the triangle trade. I mean, they were heavily involved in slave trade. So it was not just a southern institution. So it was.
Oh yes, I understand that. Yeah. Yeah. But you know, I think that this was a moment to throw all of the pre-existing society and arrangements out the window, and basically that wasn't what happened.
Good evening. I had 2 points. First of all, your idea of including other regions of British North America I found very interesting, particularly because Andrew O'Shaughnessy just released a book a couple of years ago on how the American Revolution might have been different had Britain not been so concerned about its sugar colonies, which really was the center of their attention. I was wondering if
He's right.
Yes, I would agree with him. I was wondering if you could discuss more this idea of Jamaican Maroons brought into Sierra Leone, because I found that particularly fascinating, because I had been aware that they had been used to sort of fend off rebellions in Jamaica, particularly Tacker's Revolt, but hadn't realized that they had been exported to other colonies to put down uprisings.
There was a Maroon rebellion in Jamaica which was never defeated, but the British general negotiated a ceasefire on certain terms, and then the colonial government repudiated those terms and actually exported the 500 of Maroons and their families to, once again, Chile, Nova Scotia, and which was impossible for this community. And so they, again, exactly the same story as the people, the Black Loyalists. They petitioned the British government, who was profoundly embarrassed about this, again, on a matter of honour. And so at that time, it was exactly the time that the Sierra Leone Company was trying to kind of exercise its control over the black settlers in Sierra Leone. They said, oh, they can come to Sierra Leone, it's a nice warm place, and da-da-da-da. And the British government did a deal with them, which is that you take them to Sierra Leone and we will give you a detachment of British troops to station in Sierra Leone to kind of keep the peace, to look after these troublesome, you know, emancipated slaves. And they come off the ship at the very point at which 40 of the settlers have left Freetown and are camped outside of the town. I dispute that this is a serious rebellion. I mean, I think that this is just, you know, a serious misunderstanding. But it's just, it suits the young governor, who's all of 23 years old, enormously well to suddenly have these kind of Maroons who have been promised land in Nova Scotia. To come to Sierra Leone, he tells them, or he tells their agent who tells them, who translates for them, that they can't get their land because there's this rebellion raging. And he, the governor, writes down in his diary, which is the only account that anybody ever uses about this, you know, that the Maroons, to a man, you know, volunteered to go and round them up. But then I read the account of their agent, I think his name's George Ross, who was with them, and he gives a different account. He says, they say, oh, if these fellas don't like King George, well, then we'll go and teach him a lesson because we like King George. He looks at exactly the same language that the Black Loyalists themselves use. King George is our friend, you know, he'll look up, you know, we need to deal directly with him, all these kind of intermediaries. So they were never told that what this so-called rebellion was about was an unfair tax on the land. And the moment that the Maroons, who got the redistributed land of the people who were expelled, found out that they had to pay a tax, they did exactly the same thing. They refused to pay it, but nobody was going to take them on. They were just far too much of a military society, so that they got tricked into it, basically. And interestingly, they resisted doing it. They didn't rush out there to do it. They resisted doing it and tried to get the governor to negotiate with this group of rebel settlers. And so he sent them a message saying, you know, he had these Maroon warriors and that he was going to declare war on them unless they, you know, agreed to surrender by 10 o'clock that night. And the verbal answer that he got back to this, and again, this is confirmed by George Ross's account of it, was no one in the camp could read or write, and that they didn't trust what was being read to them, and that they had to fetch somebody who could read and write, and that they would give a written answer in the morning. And between 10 o'clock at night and the morning was when the order to attack was given. And again, the account that's given by the guy who is the British agent with the Maroon community is disgusted by this. You know, he thinks that they should have waited until they got a response at least. So I think, again, you know, in my shorthand is to say, you know, the Maroons were dead keen to have a bit of physical exercise. There's no doubt about that. And once being given the order to attack, they're an incredibly effective fighting force. You know, they did their job very smartly, but they were tricked into it. There's no question about that, and they bitterly regretted it afterwards.
I have two related questions. One, has anybody told this story before? And if so, how does their conclusion differ from yours?
Well, various people have told various parts of it before. Nobody has ever told the part about people going to Australia before. This is, you know, my contribution. But also, as I was suggesting about the things I was saying about revising the historiography about the black response to the American Revolution, I do it different. I mean, I tell a completely different story. There are two books about the people who go first to Nova Scotia and then Sierra Leone, both written in 1976. And they're very good books, but they, particularly one by Ellen Gibson Wilson, which is a fine book, but she is in love with John Clarkson, as is Simon Sharma, who has also written a book about this that will come out in America quite soon. And so everything that she writes about what happens in Sierra Leone is coloured by, she's also written a biography of John Clarkson, her admiration for the Clarksons and for the abolitionists. And so she takes them at their word all the time. And she doesn't do what I'm doing, which is interrogating their own responses and looking for other accounts of it. She simply relies on the accounts of the Sierra Leone Company as to what's going on. I mean, it's a fine piece of work, but it's not. But it follows the line that these are troublesome people. They just weren't up to being the right kind of settlers. They wanted too much, that sort of thing, you know. And also that this thing that happens in 1800 isn't significant. It's, you know, a bit of a skirmish. I mean, how you account for, you know, a huge number of the most important people in the community simply being hoiked out of it and sent off to God knows where to do, you hate to think what, as not being significant, I don't know, but everybody who writes about it just kind of skids over it, as does Simon Sharma, and then goes on to, you know, in the case of the big book on Sierra Leone, talk about the Maroon Society and what develops there and stuff like that. Whereas to me, this is a very significant moment, and so that's where my book is different, I think, in that it kind of focuses on this significant parallel kind of rebellion. I've written a paper about it, which is called Washington's Revolution, George that is, Harry that is, not George, yeah. Oh, there was somebody, I hate to say, there's somebody who was going to ask a question before you.
I thought I should try to say a word, given that I am a Black American in the room tonight. The question came up how we could have prevented some of the issues of slavery, but my question to you is, what could the scholars of the world bring to the table if I said to you that even today I feel the impact of slavery pretty much every day? I would like to know what the scholars of the world could do to give me therapy for that. What could you do to keep me from feeling on February 22nd, 2006, the impact of slavery? So I want to operationalize those, how I'm feeling a little bit. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't feel that I'm at risk of an injustice because I'm Black American, and that's for truth. So I just wondered what we could do to eliminate that. Why am I continuing to feel that way? I'm fairly educated. I work hard. I've been successful with the family, but we still have those demons. So I'd like to know what the scholars of the world could bring to the table to help us minimize or delete those feelings. And thank you for writing the book. And I was a little bit sad that you were not Black American.
Wow. Well, it was a deeply painful and horrible system that went on for a very long time, that has been justified by some of the finest minds in this country, who get large best-selling books written about them endlessly. I think one of the things that the scholars might be able to do to redress some of the problems is stop writing large, best-selling, adulatory books about people who held other human beings in slavery and wrote fine tracts to justify it. And perhaps the Pulitzer Prize might once be given to somebody who actually calls slavery for what it is.
Most of the country stopped slavery before the United States.
You did right.
On your research, the newspaper reporters from around the world, how did they write about the slavery in the United States during the 18th century? Did you come across some?
Oh, well, yes, even at the time of the American Revolution, the British newspapers are very interesting about it. British newspapers run these fantastic cartoons about, the slave drivers yelping about liberty as they're kind of cracking the whip over all of these, enchained people out in their fields. The sort of rampant hypocrisy of it was not lost on very many people. And it's quite interesting that one of the things that does happen, this is where British abolitionism begins in the American Revolution, because most of the people who become abolitionists are supporters of the American Revolution, supporters of the breakaway movement in the colony. But the one thing that appalls them is the fact that the American states still cleave to this institution. And so they begin to look at themselves and say, the thing that undermines us, that undermines our position in the world is our complicity. Granville Sharp, who is the man who first dreams up the idea of the colony in Sierra Leone, is the person who most articulates the idea that Britain has lost its moral capital because of its complicity in the slave trade. And you begin to see some major kind of intellectual figures, and the newspapers is full of this stuff, talking about how we can't have an empire, and we cannot be a moral state as long as we continue to be involved in the slave trade. And this is where the whole abolitionist movement starts to take off from. So, yes, I think that as with so many other things, abolitionism has its roots in the British abolitionism has its roots in the American Revolution, not American abolitionism, which is a strange contradiction, you'd have to admit. And one of the things that's so interesting about these British generals who go to so much trouble to make sure that the promises that they made to people if you run away from your masters and come to us, we'll make you free, that they could actually honour that to the letter of the law. It seems to me that they do this not because they're anti-slavery. Some of them own slaves. It's not because they are, deeply moral people. It's because they can see that this is in the face of ignominious defeat, this is the one thing that gives them some moral capital. The fact that, and you can see it so clearly in the meeting between Guy Carleton, who did not own slaves, and George Washington, in that Carleton just seizes the high moral ground. And Washington is really taken aback. This statement about, I cannot conceive that an English king would ever agree to repudiate the promises that were made to people of any complexion. And the very suggestion, because of course he had signed this treaty that said exactly that his representatives had signed a treaty to say that they would not take away American-owned Negroes, quote, but he goes on to say the very suggestion that the king would agree to such an ignominious thing can only be taken to be an unfriendly act, which is basically saying to Washington, you say this anymore and we'll declare war on you again. You know, it's really very interesting, like, we don't hold slaves, we keep our promises to people. As far as I'm concerned, these people are free, and they are free to go anywhere in the world they choose. His language, they choose. And the certificates of freedom that he has his generals issue all say that, and is free to go anywhere in the world name so chooses. Now, it's very admirable, but at the same time you can clearly see that, you know, what they have got, these are very proud men, these British officers, and they're humiliated beyond belief by the fact that the French have beat them and now they've got to let go of the American colonies. And so this is one thing that they hold on to. So it's an interesting mixture of kind of pragmatism. It's pragmatism feeding what then becomes a kind of moral position. So a bit later you have Prime Minister Pitt telling the British, the American ambassador to Britain, John Adams, who of course is very anti-slavery, but he's been instructed by Congress that he has to complain about the fact that the British ran off with all their slaves, and Pitt agrees that that's what they did in contravention of the treaty, but he tells him they were responding to a higher moral calling, a higher moral law, a moral position that is higher than a treaty that the British government had signed. And so, of course, this is exactly the sort of stuff that you tell John Adams, who kind of tucks his tail between his legs and goes away because he completely agrees. And so what else can he do? Whereas Thomas Jefferson just foams at the mouth at this stuff and keeps saying, you know, you've stolen all my slaves. I can't pay my bills. I'm in debt. If you hadn't stolen all my slaves, I'd be able to pay you my debts. And then he goes a bit further and he says, the whole of Virginia doesn't need to pay its massive debts because the British stole our slaves. It's the difference between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
Terrify our kind author, because I really respect your work. So, to what extent has your research turned up data which contests the stereotype of blacks as not multilingual, not literate, widely traveled with skills, challenging the plantation myth where they were sophisticated, educated, free people who were coerced into this wickedness and acted as free people whenever they found allies willing to support their charge?
Well, I think that there's any number of it. I mean, all of the people in my book, they may not be multilingual, but they're fairly multilingual, come to think of it. I mean, they obviously learn to communicate with the Temne people in West Africa who are around them. They, a number of them are not necessarily fluent English speakers to begin with. And I think that their capacity to, well, the fact that they survived the American Revolution in itself is considerable. And let me tell you, the stories about the actual, you know, business of getting themselves away from, and the organisation that must have gone into organising for all of, in one case, I think, an entire Methodist congregation from the Chesapeake, from the Tidewater of Virginia to run at the one time. The kind of clandestine organisation that went into that, and the way in which that, as I say, this howling wilderness at either end of the globe, these people, in my book I say, it gives an insight into that slippery concept of freedom. Equally, that slippery, even more slippery concept of agency, an overused word. So yes, I think that one of the reasons we don't have enough of this in historiography is because there's not enough people moving beyond not just the stereotypes, but the categories, not talking about the slaves or enslaved people, to use better, more appropriate language. But, you start trying to get down to the nitty-gritty of looking at one particular person's life. All of those issues about agency with a capital A just fall away. I mean, basically you're looking at the way in which a person is negotiating freedom in an incredibly complex world, an incredibly difficult thing to do. Freedom in the 18th century is an incredibly complex idea.
You used advertisements of runaways. I just checked.
Yeah.
And they're often very, very rich.
Yeah.
With precisely that kind of information.
Well, of course they are.
And
yeah.
it's precisely that kind of information that tends to be buried because of our racism. I mean, that's what I'm
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. I think that, I think that you may well have noticed that at the beginning of my book, I talk about the pre-existing historiography, and then I say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there. I want to recover the stories of individual people. I want to show people entering their own histories, making their own lives, not having them made for them by white abolitionists or by, lawmakers or anybody else, but basically, and I don't want to use that great big overused word agency. I mean, I think people's lives are, that the lives of the people in my book are as important to me as the lives of the founding fathers, right? I guess that's all I could say about that. So I think that's it.
I'm running out of steam.
Yes.
Okay, so, but I think I do want to ask one last question, and maybe it's a big question to end on, and it picks up on some themes here. But I read this, I'll confess, I didn't quite get to the end of the book, but almost. And it's a heroic story, and I do really appreciate naming names, giving people their own personalities, and showing so clearly, I mean, really, in terms of what we can know and tell, and the ways, the extent to which we can talk about people who are enslaved, who are really buried in these back corners of archives, to be able to really pull them out and give them these very distinctive personalities. I mean, Caesar is a very different person than Harry Washington. Caesar actually turned out to be my favorite too.
Yes.
He's a remarkable guy. But
I'm sure he's handsome as well.
I don't know the way he got beat.
He will be in the movie about it anyway.
But at the same time, it's also a very tragic story. I mean, terrible things befall these people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Sierra Leone ends in a virtual disaster. Even though people do survive in Australia, the first years are just
brutal,
horrific. The punishments that people that these convicts are subjected to are just, I study slavery and I shouldn't be horrified, but these really were...
Oh, it's much more brutal system.
Were
Yes.
terrible. And when people lose loved ones, and husbands lose wives, and children die, and marriages are shattered. And so, I look at this book, and I'm reading the title, and it's Epic Journeys of Freedom, so it's kind of this glorious feel to it. But I'm wondering, what lessons do we draw from these lives about slavery, about freedom, and really about the distance between these two concepts? That it's often very easy for historians to try to separate them, to kind of present them as ideal points.
I think that it's been far too easy for historians to talk about slavery, and that the end point of slavery is this slippery concept called freedom. And one of the things that my book is really about is about negotiating freedom, how difficult freedom is, and how these people had to make freedom a tangible reality. They had to define it. I mean, they had to find a way to make that real. And I think that's something a lot of historians haven't done. They haven't followed emancipation into freedom and the process, and to see how difficult the process is and how much it needs to be negotiated over and over and over again. Certainly in the 18th century, when really the concept of freedom is for people who don't have money, education, patronage, etc., is really the freedom to choose between one master and another. And what's so striking about the people who go to Sierra Leone is that they ratchet it up another notch. You know, freedom means more than that as far as they're concerned. And they fight really hard to make sure that they get it. They have rights that far exceed the rights of any European labourers. It's quite astonishing, actually. So yes, there, finish.
So they've redefined freedom more on American terms.
Yes, absolutely on American terms.
And so yeah, so they've extended this understanding and exported it.
Exactly. They take back the reverse passage across the Middle Passage. One of the remarkable paradoxes is they take back the animating principles of the revolution that so completely excluded them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Cassandra Pybus.
Oh, thank you.